Life is a 2017, of course, movie in the horror thriller and I would say survival horror genre, and it's a movie which I went into with measured expectations. I didn't expect it necessarily to be fantastic. I did look up the score that it had on Google initially. 83% at the time seemed pretty good. Not amazing, but pretty good. So I went into it expecting hopefully a good alien horror film. Of course, it's never going to be as great as Alien originally, which is one of my favourite movies, period, but maybe it could be a modern equivalent to something like that. Alien for today's generation, if you will. Now, the trailers kind of give you a false perspective in some ways on the film, and this doesn't spoil anything specific, it's just more of an overall expectations thing, because most of the trailers have a relatively light tone. Then they released a Red Band trailer which really didn't, and if you haven't checked that out, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing so. Just acknowledge that it's a Red Band film. This is a movie that is very light on the happiness. Just go into it expecting that. This is very much so a horror film. There's very little comedy in it, and that's the way it should be. There's not much comedy in Alien either, and look how great that was. And I would actually go so far as to say that this film is probably my favourite space-based horror film since Apollo 18. And a lot of people still haven't seen Apollo 18. I did also do a review on the channel for that a while back. I'll put it in the playlist at the end of this video if you want to check that out. But that movie is amazing as far as I'm concerned. It's a found footage style, again, survival horror, and it's a fantastic horror film that people just don't talk about or appreciate. This one, I think, is going to have more appreciation than that one did because of the people involved. You've got Ryan Reynolds and Jake Gyllenhaal in particular who are really going to draw the crowds. You've got great supporting cast members as well, and everyone in the film is fantastic, but the simple fact is they don't have the same kind of name-pulling power that those two guys have. Now, as far as the plot, you basically get everything you need to know in the trailer. They're in space, on a space station. They are scheduled to rendezvous with a probe from space, which has been to Mars, and they're going to check out what it's brought back. Bits of dust, rock, debris, and hopefully some kind of cells or evidence of life that they can study. And they do. You see that in the trailer, of course, no spoilers there. And, well, it kind of goes downhill very quickly from there, as humans are known to do when they come in contact with new civilizations or new creatures. We do have a tendency to cause trouble wherever we go. But one thing that I liked about this film is that even though that ethos of humans meddling is definitely there, it wasn't browbeating you with it. It's not a film where it's like, oh, humans are so bad, we are disgusting, we deserve nothing, we should go nowhere. Yeah, you acknowledge that, but it's not put in your face all the time. It's not that kind of message movie. And another thing that I liked in the film quite a lot, actually, well, two things in particular. One, I love the music. I think that the music in this movie was incredible, especially towards the start. It was very reminiscent for me of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which also had great music, of course. And although you don't notice the music, or at least I didn't, as you go through the rest of the film, as it becomes more tense, those initial setup moments where you see the ship, you see the vistas of space, you hear the incredible music, you're half expecting a monolith to come across the screen some of the time, and those moments are important because it's setting up the atmosphere and the grand emptiness of space. And that's the point of a film like this. You've got to make the characters feel so small and so isolated, and that's why it works so well, playing on most people's natural fear of being in a confined space, which isn't necessarily a bad fear to have, because you don't want to be in too confined a space because you need to get away if necessary. And when you're in space, well, it's kind of difficult to do. But the other thing that I really enjoyed in the film, and this wasn't, again, a spoiler, of course, it's a non-spoiler review, but one other thing which I did really like is the portrayal of the characters, but not in the way of action or humour or anything like that. The thing which I actually really enjoyed was that at certain scenes in particular, characters would just stop. They wouldn't be running around, they wouldn't be shouting, cursing, screaming at each other, arguing. trying to formulate some crazy kind of plan to save Earth or destroy this creature, they would just stop, almost like they were worn out, and they would just take in the moment and try to process what's happening. After some of the deaths, the way that they react, one death in particular, which I won't spoil, but the way that they react is realistic, because in so many movies, even great ones like Alien, if you think to yourself in Alien about the deaths, people's reactions to those deaths don't last very long. Usually whatever reaction the people have is in the moment. Then the death is never revisited again because you've moved on to the next one. In this film, they don't move on. They linger on it. They leave you with that realization of how weighty that moment would be, because they don't present it as being a movie. Most movies, although obviously they're not self-aware, it's not like Deadpool, but most movies act like movies, whereas the people in this movie act like people. They try to react to things in a measured way. They try to assess their own emotions. They try to work through problems as efficiently and as capably as they can. But at the same time, sometimes they just can't. They just break down and they cannot cope with the situation that they're in. And I loved seeing that. It was so different. And I noticed it. I really noticed it. It stood out so much when it happened that films just don't do that. And it was so nice to see thought put into something like that. It really gave the film, at least for me, much more of an emotional punch. And I love that. Now, as far as stuff that I maybe didn't like, well, there wasn't much, to be honest. I really liked the film, and although some people are saying that it's a little bit predictable here and there, well, of course it is. There's only so many things you can do when you're in a spaceship. So, yes, you could say that some things are predictable, and I did predict a few things ahead of time. But at the same time, that is a nitpick. You can predict loads of films. Some of the best films ever made are pretty predictable, but they're still good. Great, even. And so I would say the only real thing that I didn't necessarily dislike, but I didn't like as much, was actually the CGI portrayal of the alien creature. It wasn't bad. It served its purpose, and it was well done. It was a menacing creature, and I was kind of worried about that going into it. I thought, well, this thing kind of looks like a starfish. How is that going to be intimidating? It is. It's a great creature. But the CGI, though very good and very well done, very well integrated into the reality of the actors and being around the CGI, that kind of thing, just would have had so much more tension for me and would have felt so much more real if it were, for instance, a really high-quality animatronic. And maybe that would have cost more or been ineffective in portraying it. Obviously, the director, for whatever reasons, decided against that, but I would have personally just liked to have seen at least some practical effects in there as well with regard to the creature. Maybe that's just the nostalgia in me, because some of my favourite movies are movies like The Thing, which is my favourite movie of all time, and that has the best practical effects ever made, as far as I'm concerned. So it's probably just me in that regard, but as I said, the CGI was fantastic. And the other small nitpick that I have, and it actually wasn't something that I didn't like about the film, it's actually something that I didn't like and found unfortunate about the marketing, and that's actually the name of the film. Is it just me, or is Life such a generically boring title? I get why they called it that. It is an appropriate title, but at the end of the day, you need people to see the film to appreciate it. And with a name as generic as Life, people are just not going to pay as much attention to this as a movie with a name like The Thing, or Alien, or Predator. They are eye-catching, memorable names. Life? Well, it's just a word that you use every day. So, again, I didn't dislike that about the movie. I just think it's a shame that the marketing doesn't really give the film the exposure and remembrance that it deserves to have. Now, as far as our individual scores, first of all, of course, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of Life, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. And if you're new to the channel, I give every film an opening gambit of 5 out of 10. That's the baseline, that's what it needs to be. Anything above that means it's doing better and better. Anything below, of course, means that it's subpar. So the fact that I'm giving it a 7 is pretty good. It's not phenomenal in terms of storyline. As I said, there are some things which you can predict. There's only so much you can do in space. But I really liked what they did with it. And the story was more than adequate for what it was trying to do. I really enjoyed it. It wouldn't be fair to extremely complex or clever movies to rate it even higher than that, but still, a 7 is not bad at all, especially for a movie that's so relatively simple when you really think about it. Next up we have the characters, the motivations, the actors' portrayals of them, etc. And for that I'm going to give it an 8, which is a pretty decent score to get. And although I wouldn't say that anyone in the film is necessarily Oscar level, not that that's the be-all and end-all of course, but I would say that the performances were excellent across the board. Every single person in the film is someone who, regardless of their backstory or screen time, you do care for, and that was great. It's not easy to have a relatively short movie with a relatively short time frame for personal development and character fleshing out, but at the same time developing and producing characters that you do care about and don't want them to die. This film, I think, managed to do that very well. And also in that score is the fact that I mentioned earlier, that they react to things in a very realistic way, and that is not to be discounted. It was very refreshing to see that, and I really appreciated the choice of presenting them that way. As far as the visuals, the special effects, makeup, CGI, if and where used, etc., well, it is an effects-heavy movie. You've got some practical effects in terms of the zero-gravity appearance of the film. You've got the CGI of the creature, the cinematography of space, all that kind of thing. And it's fantastic. I loved the way the film looked. I loved the camera work. You notice the camera work a lot more at the start of the film. And as I said before, you need to, because it sets you up in the world, it clues you in as to what kind of movie to expect. And at the start I noticed the camera work quite a lot. You had, as I said earlier, the beautiful vistas of space, but you also had stuff like sometimes the camera would be upside down because they're in a ship and they're upside down. So it wasn't like that all the way through the film, but the fact that they would do that every so often changed it up. It kept you focused on what was happening to not miss anything, and it looked fantastic. Every shot in the film looked fantastic. The ship itself looked interesting. It's not necessarily easy to make the inside of a spaceship or a space station look good, but it did look good, and there were some interesting homages to other films again, such as Alien, with some of the things that were on the ship. So for me, it's an easy 9 out of 10 in that regard, because yeah, it was fantastic in every way. It's not a perfect 10, and the main reason why it's not a perfect 10 for me is because, as I mentioned earlier, the CGI of the creature, although really well done, and I don't have any problem with it, I just would have liked at least some practical effects to complement that. But that's just me, of course. Next up then we have the audio, the soundtrack, the music, the sound effects in general, and for that I'm going to give the film an 8, which is pretty high for me. I don't tend to rate many films that highly in terms of the soundtrack and sound effects. Many films do go above what's required, but not necessarily a huge amount above. Then you get some films which have amazing soundtracks or amazing sound design. I would say an example of a movie with a great soundtrack is Rubber, another horror film, a very oddball one that's out there, one of my favourite movies. Fantastic soundtrack. Then you've got other movies which have more of a fantastic sound design or sound effect element, such as The Babadook, which is incredible for sound design. This film, I would say, actually manages to combine both of those in a very complementary way. I already mentioned that the music is fantastic, and it really is, but also the effects, sometimes the quietness of the environment, again, complements the scene, the portrayals of the characters, even the creature itself. I really enjoyed it. And finally, the most subjective category to me personally is of course the rewatchability factor and the entertainment level of the film for me. And for that, I'm going to give Life another 8, which is pretty high. And I had to deliberate on that score for a while, because at the moment I'm really looking forward to watching it again, but I generally need to leave a little bit of time to know for certain how rewatchable it's going to be. With most films I have a really good inclination of what it's going to be like, and 99% of the time I'm right. But some of the time my opinion of it changes over time and the rewatchability may drop or increase. In the case of this film, I would say that the score that I'm giving it is predominantly due to the entertainment factor rather than the rewatchability. Because yes, it definitely does have rewatchability, but the majority of the reason why I'm giving it that 8 is because of how good the overall package and the layout of the film is. Great characters, great music, great sound effects, a great creature, a great environment, great cinematography, and a story which wasn't mind-blowing, of course, but definitely served its purpose very well. And overall, I have to applaud it for that. It wasn't a perfect 10 or even a 9, but still, an 8 is not bad at all. And overall, that means that as a tabulation of our 5 categories put together, I'm giving Life a very respectable score of 4 out of 5. That may not sound incredibly high, given how praising I was of the film in general, but a 4 out of 5 for me is a pretty good score. No film I've ever reviewed so far has gone above a 4.5, as an example, so a 4 is not bad at all. Overall, if you haven't checked it out yet, I'd definitely recommend doing so, and of course, if you don't get the chance to see it in cinemas, you should definitely check it out later on if you have the chance. If you're a fan of survival horror, space horror, science fiction even, to some degree, then I think you will enjoy it. But that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.